Y vamos a comenzar. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have today Professor François Recanati as the keynote speaker of our second philosophy graduate. ¿Nos escucha? Hola, hola. ¿No? ¿Nos escucha?
Sí.
¿Pero el micrófono se escucha o no se escucha?
No.
No importa, habla. Ok. Bueno. Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have today Professor François Recanati as the keynote speaker of our second philosophy graduate conference. Professor Recanati doesn't need an extensive introduction. His influential works on philosophy of mind and language and cognitive science are well known by all of us. Besides, he's the current director of the Nicod Institut. In this occasion, Professor Recanati will offer us a talk called Semantic Entry Points of Speaker's Meaning. So thank you, Professor Recanati, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much. I'm very glad, honored by this invitation. I'm happy to be among you here, and thanks for the organizer. Thanks to the organizers for that. So I'm going to talk about the language issues, and I'm going to offer sort of a general picture. I'm not really going to provide a lot of arguments for the various points I made, but it's really a matter of trying to put forward a picture, and an alternative picture, alternative with respect to what's still very widespread view of how linguistic interpretation works. So I start by precisely a view that's obviously wrong. That's what I call the naive view of communication. I don't know what view is. It shouldn't be color, but anyway.
Yes, it is color.
It shouldn't be. So that's something that's still very widespread. So it's a certain picture of linguistic communication where you start with someone having some knowledge, having a piece of information that the person wishes to communicate to someone else. And then, because they have a common language, the speaker uses a sentence which encodes that piece of information. So the idea is that the speaker has a belief or knows that P and wants to communicate that proposition, that belief, to the hearer. And to do that, she actually utters a sentence which encodes that content, which expresses the proposition that P. And as a result, the hearer, if he trusts the speaker, will actually come to believe that P. And so there are all sorts of problems with this view. I mean, I'm not going to talk about this view of communication. It's just a starting point. But one of the problems is that the speaker and the hearer believe, and it's not absolutely clear that they believe the same content, or that the content that is being communicated is just one thing. There are reasons to think, especially in cases involving lexicals and so on, there are reasons to believe that actually the content that's expressed by the speaker and the content that the hearer gets from the communication act are not the same, so it should be much more complicated. But anyway, the aspect of the view that I'm going to look at is just one thing that's assumed. That's the idea that the meaning of the sentence, what's included, linguistically encoded, is the same thing as the content of the belief which the speaker expresses, and also the same thing as the content of the belief which the hearer acquires. And that seems to be clearly wrong, because the meaning of a sentence is not a proposition. So the content of the belief, the content of the speaker's belief is a proposition. The speaker believes that P or P is a proposition, and possibly that's also what the hearer comes to believe. Let's assume that it is just for simplification. But the meaning of the sentence cannot be equated to that proposition, because we know that the meaning of a sentence is not propositional, it's more like a character in Kaplan's terms, which determines the proposition given the context, but it's not itself a proposition. So we need at least to revise the view, but it's not a revision that's, very difficult. It's not costly. We can simply accept that things are a bit more complicated because the meaning of the sentence and the proposition is not the same, but the meaning of the sentence in context determines the proposition. And that's exactly what people say. There is this idea of determination, linguistic meaning as determined by grammar, by the rules of the language, in turn determines assertory content in context. So that's this view I call the determination thesis. And that's actually what I'm going to criticize. I think that's wrong, and we should acknowledge that it is. But before moving to that issue, when we talk about determination, we might think that there are all sorts of variants or all sorts of ways of making sense of that. So there might be a sort of a extreme case in which the meaning of the sentence just is the content, in which case it's pretty trivial that there will be determination because there will be identity between what the sentence encodes and the proposition that's expressed. But we can also accept with Kaplan that it's more complicated, that there are several steps. So for example, one step, first we have the grammar determines character for the sentence. So the roots of the language determine the meaning of the sentence, and that in turn, in context, determines the proposition. So we need one step. And there might even be more than one step, which is also what Kaplan believes. And because we might think that Kaplanian contents are not exactly the same thing as the content of what we believe when we believe what the speaker said. Because Kaplanian contents are temporal propositions. Those are technical issues, we don't need to go into that, but in the full picture, there would be actually two steps. We would go the rules of the language or the grammar would determine for the sentence its meaning. And then the meaning in context would determine the Kaplanian content or some intermediate level of content. And that would, again, in context, determine the full assertory content. Anyway, that doesn't matter which position actually we take on this issue, how many steps are involved. What I really want to talk about is this determination thesis itself. The idea that linguistic meaning as determined by grammar in terms determines assertory content, because I believe that's wrong. That's wrong at least in some cases. And my point is that it's interesting to consider what happens if we generalize what happens in those cases to all cases. Okay, so what I want to say, maybe that's what everybody accepts anyway, it seems. So maybe it's just façon de parler when people talk about determination. But the idea is that actually, no, linguistic meaning does not determine content, but constrains content. So linguistic meaning brings constraints, and something else determines content given those constraints. And the something else, basically, on the view I'm defending, is speaker's meaning. And speaker's meaning is something quite different from linguistic meaning. It's not at all a matter of rules of the language. It's something different, has to do with speaker's intentions in speaking and also the hearer's recognition of those intentions, that sort of thing. So I assume some notion of speaker's meaning, some Brycean notion of speaker's meaning, and the point is, on the alternative view I'm sort of putting forward, linguistic meaning doesn't determine content. You need speaker's meaning to fix content. And the only thing that linguistic meaning brings are actually constraints on the determination of content, on the content to be determined. That is, the content will have to satisfy the constraints. So, but will fix the content actually speaker's meaning, but under the constraints provided by linguistic meaning. And so I said that there is at least one type of case for which it's pretty clearly what we need, this notion that there is a sort of a division of labor between the linguistic, division of labor between the linguistic rules on the one hand, speaker's meaning on the other hand. They work together to determine content. So the case, the obvious case in which that's what we need is the case of demonstratives. Words like this, that man. So in that case, we can certainly talk about the content in the Kaplanian sense of a demonstrative being the object or person we are referring to is that demonstrated that man would refer to a certain man, and that would be the contribution. The man would be the contribution to the content of the utterance. So we may call that the semantic content of the demonstrative in this context, or perhaps the semantic reference of the demonstrative in this context. But what's important is that in the case of demonstrative, the semantic reference of a demonstrative piggybacks on the speaker's reference. What's primary is the speaker's reference. There must be someone or something that the speaker using a demonstrative is actually referring to, where to refer something that the person does here. There must be someone he or she is referring to. And then that thing will be the semantic reference of the demonstrative, at least if the linguistic constraints are satisfied, by which I mean constraints like being male or female. So if you point to a female person saying he, there is some linguistic constraints is apparently violated, so you might say that in this case, even though there is speaker's reference, it doesn't count as a semantic reference. But that's, again, all the linguistic rules provide, constraints. Okay, so let's talk about demonstrative. And of course, Kaplan has himself has been very conscious of that distinction between two cases, the cases of what he calls the pure indexicals, for which there is a rule of reference. There is something that actually determines the reference in context, in the case of a pure indexical. Like in the case of I, there is a rule that I refers to the speaker, and that's in context, given the context in which, say, I'm speaking, that determines me as the reference of I. So it seems that here we understand what it means for the linguistic meaning or character of an expression to determine the content in context. But for demonstrative like she, that sort of thing, it seems that there is no such rule. It seems that here the speaker is free to refer to whatever she wants. Of course, within limits. Again, that's a matter of the linguistic constraints. So if you say she, there is a constraint which the person you're referring to must satisfy in order to be the semantic reference. That person must be female. Of course, you can say she and refer to a male person, and that would be fine, but that wouldn't be fine. There would be an issue whether that's really the semantic content. Probably not, because nothing is the semantic content unless it satisfies the presuppositions carried by the expression you use. But in the normal case, I mean, whether the presuppositions are satisfied or not, what really fixes the content has got to be speaker's meaning. It's the primary thing. In the case of demonstratives, that's very clear. That's pretty clear that which female person you refer to when you say she is up to you. It really depends on your intention. Of course, not just your intention in your mind, but this intention has to be graspable. That is, the other person must understand what your intention is. So the intention must be made manifest in context and so on and so forth. There are those extra conditions which are just pragmatic conditions. But it's really up to you who you refer to when you say she. Okay. Now, because there is no linguistic rule in the case of demonstratives, or something very minimal, like the speaker must refer to some female person, for example. But anyway, there is no rule that fixes the reference, and because there is no such rule, it's necessary very often for the speaker to give some indications about who he or she has in mind. If what the speaker has in mind is what determines the reference, then it's better if the hearer knows what the speaker has in mind. And in some cases, that's maybe pretty obvious, but not always. So the speaker needs to do something to externalize his or her intention, as Kaplan says. And for that, you use what Kaplan calls demonstrations. You point, for example, or you do things like that. So you have to reveal your intention, and pointing is a way of revealing your intention. And the demonstration can take any form. So I mentioned pointing, but also the direction of gaze. That's good enough. Also, it's very important to realize that the pointing is there, the demonstration is only there to help the hearer understand what the speaker has in mind. So if it's antecedently pretty clear what the speaker has in mind, there's no need for any pointing. And that's often the case when it's absolutely clear what the speaker is talking about. Also, there is this interesting generalization that there are some kinds of expression that sort of indicates that the speaker's reference must already be salient, already be present in everybody's mind. So for example, if you use an unstressed pronoun, that means that the hearer to whom you're talking is already thinking about that thing or that person. So very easy to find out whom we're talking about if I'm using an unstressed pronoun. It's just the person you have in mind, something like this. Anyway, so there are cases in which no pointing is necessary and so on and so forth. Okay, now, as Kaplan said, there is this rather big difference between the two types of cases. There is the pure indexed rules for which there is a rule, linguistic rule, a character that fixes reference or content in context. And cases like demonstratives in which there is no such rule and there is a need for something additional like a demonstration to determine what the content is. And I'm saying that demonstration is just an externalization of speaker's reference. Now, one might be happy with that division between two cases. But some people might think that it would be much better to have, at least for formal purposes, to have a sort of unified accountable that covers the two cases as well. And that's, I believe, what Kaplan would say himself. So how can we achieve unification? Well, there is a standard way to achieve unification in this regard, which is to just take the model of the pure indexed rules and to extend it to the demonstratives. So in the case of pure indexables, there are rules of reference, like I refers to the speaker, U refers to the addressee, and that sort of thing. And the rule is enough in context to fix the reference. And you might say that that's the same thing for demonstratives. There is a rule. Of course, I've just said that there was no rule. That when you say she, you may refer to whoever you want. There's nothing that will determine who you're referring to except what you mean, speaker's meaning. But one might take that on board and put that into the rule. And that's what some people do. By saying that the rule is precisely in the case of demonstratives, that the linguistic rule is that the demonstrative refers to what the speaker has in mind, provided it satisfies presuppositions. Okay, that's a possible linguistic rule. There are also people, there used to be people who wanted to have linguistic rules that don't appeal to speaker's intentions or to speaker's meaning, like the rule that the demonstrative refers to the first object of the relevant category that intersects the straight line emanating from the speaker's pointing finger. There was a time when people tried to think something that was really like the rules for pure indexed rules. And that doesn't work because precisely we need speaker's meaning. So there is no such objective rule would do the work. We have counterexamples in every case. So we need speaker's meaning, but it's possible to say, okay, we need speaker's meaning, but then we build a rule that appeals to speaker's meaning, and for demonstrative, the rule is that the demonstrative refers to what the speaker who uses demonstrative refers to, something like this. Okay. Now, I can go into that actually interesting issue, but there is something deeply wrong about this way of going, I think. And so many people have criticized it, but I won't spend time on this. Let me simply say that this seems to be an ad hoc way of saving the determination thesis. The question is, does linguistic meaning determine reference or content? And in some cases, it seems that it does. And in other cases, it seems that it doesn't. There are counterexamples, the demonstrative counterexamples. In the demonstrative cases, what determines the reference seems to be speaker's meaning, not linguistic meaning. But then you say, okay, but we can save the thesis that linguistic meaning determines reference by accepting that it's actually speaker's meaning that determines reference, but we build all that into the linguistic rule in such a way as to save the idea that in all cases linguistic meaning determines reference. In that case, linguistic meaning determines reference only redundantly because it's already been determined by the speaker's meaning, and we need to actually appeal to the speaker's meaning to make the rule work. And there's something deeply wrong with that, but again, I'm not going to talk about it. Let me simply say that it's much simpler to give up the determination thesis and to acknowledge the role of speaker's meaning in the determination of content. Again, this is something which the view that I'm criticizing also acknowledges in its own way, because it needs speaker's meaning, it builds into the linguistic meaning of the demonstratives. So it also acknowledges that, but it adds another linguistic rule that's absolutely not needed, because if you give up the determination thesis, so the reference will be not determined, underdetermined, or underspecified, but then you have these pragmatic matters that will come into the picture and help completing the work. So there really is no need to actually replicate that pragmatic work into the linguistic tool itself. But anyway, the main argument in favor of this view that I'm criticizing here, not really criticizing it because I'm not providing the argument, but I'm saying that it's not a very good view, it's not an attractive view, but the main argument in its favor is that it unifies the two classes, and that's good to have a unified mechanism. It's better, again, as I said, at least for all purposes. Right, but then I respond to that argument by saying that if we really want to unify, I'm not absolutely sure that it's a good thing here to unify the two classes. But if we want to do that, we can also do that in the other direction. So there are two ways to do it, so we don't have to do it that way. We can start with the demonstratives, for which we know that it's speaker's meaning that fits its reference under the constraints of linguistic meaning. And we can extend the analysis that works for them to pure indexicals, treating them as a sort of limiting case. And that's what some people do in linguistics. So let's go back to demonstratives. A third-person pronoun like he or she, I said semantically refers to the speaker's reference, whatever it is, provided it satisfies the rather meager presuppositions carried by the pronoun. Here the presupposition is male, female. Okay, something like that. Now, what about the pure indexical? Suppose we want to say the same thing. Suppose we want to say speaker's meaning that fits its reference under the constraints provided by linguistic meaning. Well, the only difference with the case of the pure indexicals is that in the case of the pure indexicals, the presupposition carried by the expression, the constraints on what the reference can be, is much more substantial. Instead of saying the reference must be male, of course there are plenty of male people, so that doesn't really fix the reference. You need something else. But if you say the reference must be the speaker, well, that's very specific. There is only one speaker, let's say, in a, let's consider a very small situation, some speech act. So in that case, it seems that the presupposition or the constraint itself is uniquely identifying. But it's compatible with the idea that it's the same. We should accept the same general view that what fits its reference is the speaker's reference, but that has to satisfy the presupposition. So you can refer, when you say I, you can refer to whoever you want, provided that person satisfies the presupposition, provided that person is the speaker. It does this all the time when I give PowerPoint presentation. We'll come back. I don't know how it is here. Oh.
If you click on the image,
it's sort of white screen.
No. It's okay.
So of course, so I don't think. Do I have time? Yeah. No. So maybe in the Q&A we'll talk about what can happen. Is it really possible to refer to anybody by saying I? Or can you make mistakes? Those are all the questions that arise in this respect. But anyway, so I'm pointing out that it's possible to unify in the other direction by taking the pure indexicals to be a limiting case in which the presupposition carried by the expression itself is very constraining, or say possibly to the point of uniquely identifying the reference, which I'm not totally sure about this uniqueness business. Okay, even for I or you. Okay, so we could say that even if the presupposition happens to be satisfied by a unique object, maybe the speaker, the general rule for the interpretation of pronouns still applies, even if you're talking about personal pronoun like first person or second person. You can say that the semantic reference of the pronoun, whatever its category, is the value of the speaker referential contextual assignment. So the speaker assigns a value reference to the pronoun, and that is the semantic reference, provided it satisfies the presupposition. If it doesn't, that's another matter. But if it does satisfy the presupposition, that's the semantic reference. And in the case at hand, I'm using I mean myself, suppose, but I might mean someone else. And there is the presupposition that the person I'm referring to is the person speaking, making the utterance. And if the presupposition is satisfied, that's the semantic reference. So that would be the view, but that would work for indexicals and pronouns in general. But I think that actually the sort of view that I like goes well beyond that. I would like to generalize this sort of view and to reference in general. And that's a view, the view I like actually, is a view that was well known. It was the view of people in the 50s, the ordinary English philosophers. People say very bad things about them, don't really read them very much, or people like Donnellan, he was not an ordinary English philosopher, but was all defending the same view. This is a very reasonable view. But anyway, so the idea that some people had was that reference is anyway not something that the words do. It's not, words don't refer, so there is a category mistake here. It's not words, so people refer, as I said, and reference is in the sort of framework I'm currently elaborating the mental file framework. Reference is really a mental matter, it's not a linguistic matter, not primarily a mental matter, so people do mentally refer, they think about objects, and that's reference at the mental level, and this is done through, on my view, mental files, which are a sort of device that you use, and that's a bit like singular terms in the language of thought. So that's primarily something mental. There is reference at the mental level. Linguistic expressions don't refer because, again, it would be a category mistake, but there is reference in the secondary sense for linguistic expression whenever an expression is associated by the speaker with the relevant thought or the relevant mental file actually referring to some object. So expressions are associated with files. Files do refer, files which are mental things, do refer, and when you associate an expression with a certain file, the expression inherits the file inherits the reference of the file it's associated with. So on this view, reference is always speaker's reference. There is no other kind of reference. Of course, there are linguistic expressions, so there is an issue whether or not there are referring expressions in the language, but what we mean by referring expression is just expression whose role is to refer. That is, expressions such that we know when they are used, that the speaker must be deploying some mental file and referring to some object. And in order to understand what is said, the hearer must also do the same thing, deploy mental file and think about some object. That's what understanding the speaker comes to. I don't remember what I was saying really. Anyway, on this view, there is referential expressions are expressions whose role is to refer, that is, whose role is to trigger the opening of the mental file or something like this. So whose role is to be paired with some act of mental reference. But still, the act of reference is primarily mental, even if there are expressions that encode the fact that some mental act of reference has got to take place when the expression is used. Okay. So I would think that reference is always speaker's reference on this view, as again Donnellan or ordinary language philosophers held. Now, before moving to other speech functions than reference, because the sort of what I'm doing here is trying to put forward this account as a very general account, not only of reference, but of everything. But first, there is an obvious objection that there is a quite important distinction we have in the philosophy of language between speaker's reference and semantic reference. And we don't want to give up that distinction. So it's pretty clearly possible for someone to use an expression wrongly, say, for example, to have a certain object in mind and talk about, say, Jones is breaking the leaves, and actually the person has in mind happens to be Smith that he's looking at. So in this case, it seems that the speaker's reference, what the speaker has in mind, is one thing, but the semantic reference, that is the name Jones, seems to refer to someone else. And we don't want to lose that. Yes, okay, but I think that it's important to realize that it's not because we go the way of Donnellan or the ordinary English philosophers that we will lose that distinction. We will have to revise it for sure. It won't be exactly the same distinction, but we will, the substitute distinction we will end up with is the distinction between semantic reference. We can keep the notion, I've actually just defined it before and a few slides before. So we will have a distinction between the semantic reference, but not speaker's reference. Why? Because all reference is speaker's reference on this view, and semantic reference is just a sort of speaker's reference. It is speaker's reference that satisfies the presuppositions conveyed by the linguistic material. So there is only speaker's reference. Semantic reference is just a subclass, but there is another subclass which we may call mere speaker's reference. That is that speaker's reference, something that the speaker refers to, but that doesn't count as semantic reference because the presuppositions of the linguistic material are not satisfied. So for example, in the case I mentioned, in which I look at Smith and I say, oh, Johnson is breaking the leaves, That's actually a complex example, but let's pretend it's not complex. And so in that case, indeed, I refer to Smith, but the presupposition that he is Jones or that he's called Jones or whatever the presupposition might be in that case is not satisfied. So it would be mere speaker's reference. So we still have the contrast between the cases in which I say, oh, Jones is writing the leaf, I'm pointing to Jones. That would be a case in which the semantic reference is Jones, as many people would agree, everybody would agree, sorry. We contrast that case with the case in which I refer to Smith, and the presupposition is not satisfied, and therefore Smith doesn't count as a semantic reference, but as mere speaker reference. So we don't lose the distinction, we simply revise it somewhat. Okay, now, as I said, I want to present a picture that covers not just reference, but every basic speech function. Because I think that every basic speech function should display speaker meaning dependency. It's really its content in general that's not determined by linguistic meaning, but merely constrained by it, and if we need speaker's meaning to participate in the determination process, then that should go beyond just reference in the narrow sense of, say, singular reference. Or so let's look. What I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is look at the other major speech functions. So I say Jones is breaking the leaves. I refer to Jones or to Smith, and then I predicate of Smith or Jones the property of breaking the leaves. So predication is another major speech function. But also, it's not necessary for me to refer to anyone if I want to predicate being breaking the leaves. I might also quantify I could say everybody's breaking the leaves nowadays or something like this. In which case I wouldn't have referred to anybody in particular, but there would be quantification rather than reference. Now those things, quantification, predication, reference, seem to be really the basic speech functions. I'm also going to talk about assertion, the fact that when you have a content determined the way I suggest, then there is the assertion of the content. That's also something important that I think we have to talk about for reasons that I will explain. But let's talk at quantification and predication to see whether here as well we find something like speaker meaning dependency. And I think we do. Now that's particularly in the case of quantification because, well, yeah, there are some debates about exactly how to formulate this, but there is this universal, that's controversial, there is this phenomenon of contextual domain restriction. When you have a quantified sentence like everybody is raking the leaves, then there is the issue of what the domain is. Everybody, which domain? So you need a sort of an implicit restriction of the domain of quantification to make sense of such a sentence that we're talking about the students or whatever. But you need some domain that has to be provided through speaker's meaning. It's really a matter of what the speaker means. Again, there is not much constraint on that. Now, of course, some people would say, well, there are different views about these matters. My view is that we always need, whenever there is quantification, we always need a speaker-meant restriction on the domain of quantification. And there is, of course, a special case. That's the case in which what the speaker means, the domain which is meant, is the universal domain, everything, absolutely everything in the universal, if that makes sense. So there is this case. Let's suppose that there is indeed this case. I think it's just a special case in which what the speaker means is that domain, the universal domain. It's very unlikely, though. It's very hard to find such examples. But when they exist, they might maybe be treated as just a special case. The general mechanism of implicit contextual domain restriction, and that's it. But again, what fixes the domain is what the speaker means. That can be this universal domain. The alternative view would say, no, what's literally meant by a sentence like everybody is breaking the leaves is this universal interpretation. That's the only one that's fixed by linguistic meaning, and that means everybody in the universe. And what you actually mean is that everybody in a smaller group is breaking the leaves. That's not literal. That's something more. That's speaker's meaning in the traditional sense of something that departs from semantic content. But I prefer the first view I mentioned. I think antecedently it looks better for all sorts of reasons that maybe don't agree. But anyway, that's the view. That's the view that in the case of quantification, it's pretty obvious that here we need speaker's meaning. It's even more obvious than in the case of reference. I mean, because everybody accepts that there is something like that with quantifiers. Okay, and now there is an interesting thing, which is whether we can reduce the context dependence of reference to the context dependence of quantification. I mentioned that because Hoffman and Manley, in their book, the reference book, I tried to argue that, but maybe I'll come back to that issue at the end if I have time. But I want to talk about predication because that's really the big thing. Because it's common to hold that those aspects where speaker's meaning is involved and there is context dependence, this is really something that has to do with reference. There are arguments given by people like Peirce and others that reference has got to involve context. It's intrinsic to reference, but predication is a very different business. And most people think that in the case of predication, I mean, there may be context-sensitive expressions, predicate expressions, yes, but in general, no. In general, you have expressions in the language, they express or denote properties or relations, and that's it. And then you encode, if you understand the language, you know exactly which property it is that is being described to the thing that you're referring to. Now, I think that's wrong. I think that's exactly the same with predication as with reference. It's not true that reference is more context-dependent or involves speaker's meaning in a deeper way than predication does. It's exactly the same thing, I would think. Why? Because there is the phenomenon that many people talk about. We just talked about it in the previous talk with Aristotle and polysemy and others. But anyway, there's this phenomenon of polysemy, which people tend to pay lip service to. So, but generally it doesn't play a big role in the theory, because it's considered to be a form of ambiguity. And ambiguity, the fact that an expression has several meanings, is something that's supposed to be pre-semantic in some way. You must first select the right meaning before actually going further and assigning semantic content to the sentence. So it's pre-semantic in the sense that it's a prerequisite of the process of semantic interpretation that will eventuate in the delivery of semantic content. And I note here that this stuff about ambiguity and the pre-semantic character of certain phenomena that we may therefore ignore reminds me of a time when, that's something that's been forgotten, but there was a time when indexicality itself was considered a form of ambiguity. It was called systematic ambiguity. Anyway, and now we know that it is a form of context sensibility, which is better not to confuse with ambiguity. Okay, so let's look very, very rapidly at the phenomenon of polysemy. The idea of polysemy, not only the idea of that there are polysemous expressions, but the idea that words in the language are polysemous, that's a general property that they have. It's extremely difficult to find words in the language that are not polysemous. So let's take polysemy to be something general in the language, but of course philosophers and logicians and traditionally they've just abstracted from the phenomenon, just as they've abstracted from ambiguity to make things simpler. But if you look at things from a sort of linguistic perspective, then you have to acknowledge that there is this phenomenon and it has to be somehow dealt with in the theory. So what polysemy shows is that lexical items of the predicative variety do not encode ready-made predicates. So it's not as if you've got the word and the predicate is there that's encoded directly, and if you're the hearer, you know what's been predicated because you know the meaning of the word, you know the conventions of the language. That's not how things work, because polysemy forces a distinction between the lexical meaning of the expression type in the language and the content that it contributes, that is the predicates, that the thing that's been predicated of the object you're referring to if you're referring to something. So the contributed content, I say, is the predicates, and the polysemous expression contributes distinct predicates depending on the context, so that's a problem. So we want to say that it's something similar, very similar to what we have in the case of indexicality. There are these two levels. There is the linguistic meaning of the expression type, and then there are the contents contributed in context. We have the same two levels. So let me give you an example of polysemy from a book by Fajardo and Turner. So that's the case of adjective safe. In the sentences, well, actually, just illustrative because I'll show that the sentences safe takes on different meanings in the three sentences, but even if you focus on one of the sentences, all the meanings in the right context you could get as well. So it's not that it's mandatory, but still, it's illustrative. So you said the beach is safe, you said the children are, think of a scene, that's the scene, what they describe in the book. They describe a scene in which there are children playing on the beach with a shovel or something like that. Shovel, sorry. So the beach is safe, the children are safe, the shovel is safe. So my claim is that the readings of safe are different in the three sentences, in the sense that different properties are ascribed to the subject of the sentences. And therefore, if, for example, you fix the subject, like the shovel is safe, you will have, as I said, the same different options. Safe might mean different things, even if you fix the reference to the shovel, and the truth conditions will be different depending on which property you have in mind. So properties are something like this. So when you say the beach is safe, you mean that no harmful event is likely to take place there. So it's typically talking about locations or that sort of thing. You can describe it as safe, others are not. So I may say the area of the city in which I live is safe, maybe others area are not. But when you say the children are safe, that's not what you mean. You're not describing to the children the property, but they're not a location, you see what I mean. So when you say the children are safe, you mean that they can be harmed, which is quite different. And when you say the shovel is safe, they're playing with the shovel, and you say the shovel is safe, you mean that no harm can result from its use. Again, so I think there are these three distinct properties there, and if you, as I said, if you, so for example, if shovel is safe, you might give the safe the sense in that sentence it has in the second sentence, safe number 2. So when you say the children are safe, you mean that they can be harmed, but you may also care about the shovel. It may be very precious, and you're worried that the children are playing with it, so they might break it. And then someone might say, no, it's safe, it's too solid, they can't do anything to it or something like that. So you could possibly use that safe in that second sense. So another example, which comes from an area which is important because we realize that the more frequent the use of a word is in the language, the more polysemous it is. So there is sort of, all words are polysemous, as I said, except the words that you just coined now. So when you introduce a word with a definition, that's not polysemous. But as soon as you start using the word, it will, of necessity, become polysemous because there will be some modulation that will come as part of language use. You will adjust meaning to the particulars of the situation. And if that's done a number of times, that will conventionalize, and therefore we'll get something like polysemy very soon. But words that are used all the time, because that's the most frequent of the language, the core lexical items, they are highly polysemous. That is, they can have quite a big number of meanings. And so here I give this example of the to get in English is a good case. In French, we don't have, as John Perry noticed many times, French misses the word get. That's a problem for the French language, in fact, because it's such an important word. How can the language not have it? But anyway, so here I've got the sentence Smith has got the virus. And so 2 of the possible readings, and there are many, like he had contracted the virus, or he's a scientist and he has collected a sample of the virus. Fine, you can express these things with this sentence. Truth conditions would be different in the 2 cases. But of course, it's the word get, which has this meaning, pretty univocal, but still polysemous. Okay, so because there are words like this, if there's a problem, what does get mean exactly? You can't be too specific of what it means. If you say something like possession, it's too specific. There will be plenty of examples that will use get in a sense that will be different. So it seems that in order to provide the semantic analysis of such lexical items, you have to say that the meaning is something very schematic, very abstract. And indeed, that's what, among the theorists of polysemy, there is this guy, Charles Roux, who's written a book called On Monosemy, very interesting because he has a big corpus of examples and proves some interesting facts about polysemy. But what he says is that those expressions, they're not really polysemic, they are monosemic. They have a single meaning, but that meaning is extremely abstract and underspecified. So for example, if you take, it's been noted that, for example, prepositions, they are both an abstract and a concrete sense, that they are polysemous, and many expressions are both an abstract and a concrete sense. So what rule does with such expressions is that it says if there are indeed occurrences with an abstract sense and occurrences with a concrete sense, that means basically that the basic meaning is neutral. It's not specified in this dimension, abstract versus concrete. And it does the same for all the dimensions. Whether intentionality is involved or not, if there are cases in which not, then that means that the linguistic lexical meaning itself is not specified in that dimension. And it ends up with, on the basis of an empirical work, because it's not something that you can guess just from your intuition, ends up with extremely abstract meanings for expressions. And it says that those thematic meanings of the expression type run below the level of consciousness. We are not aware of those meanings. The only thing we are aware of are the particular specified meanings which work take in context when we use them. And it's something then much more specific, and there are all sorts of determinations that come from other aspects of the context, of the linguistic or extra-linguistic context, but not from the lexical item itself. And he thinks that people have been misled by this into putting all those characterizations into the linguistic meaning, and therefore saying that the word is ambiguous, because there are all these senses, sometimes abstract, sometimes concrete, many senses. But he says, no, if you go abstract enough, you'll find that there is a single sense. So that's one view, but the problem with Rule's view is that it doesn't seem that the meaning of a polysemous expression reduces to an abstract schema, which is what Rule wants to say. So Rule accepts that there are senses of those expressions that are conventionalized. So for example, get the virus in the sense of contracted. It's clearly conventionalized. It's a collocation, there is a sense that everybody has stored in memory and can provide on demand when the context is appropriate. So it's pretty clear that, and as I said, polysemy is a matter of conventionalization. It starts from modulation, but it's conventionalized modulation, basically. So we have to say that the expression is also associated in memory with conventional ways of using it, with determinate senses. But if we say that, it seems that we accept some kind of ambiguity. We accept that the same lexical item, and we think it's part of the competence with the expression to know that there are these senses that are very common. It's certainly part of the competence, and it's actually listed in dictionaries, the senses which polysemous expression can take. But if we say that, it seems that we accept the ambiguity view, that there is this lexical item and there are all these senses that are conventionalized. And you have to know them if you know the language. So is this ambiguity? No, it's really something, polysemy is really interesting because it's intermediate between, say, ambiguity and modulation. It's really something intermediate. So it's true that there are distinct senses for most of those expressions. But in polysemy, the difference with the case of ambiguity or homonymy, the difference is that there is, in polysemy, there is semantic unity over and above the distinctness of the senses. So there are distinct senses. But those senses are felt as belonging to the same family. So it's part of the speaker or the language user's competence that they know that the senses are related. And not only they know that, but in most cases they sort of know what the relation is also between the senses. So because of that, polysemy can be reduced to homonymy. We need to provide a semantic unity. Simply listing senses, as we do for ambiguous expression, wouldn't do. That wouldn't be faithful to the phenomenon. So there is another view which I like very much, and I just mentioned it. It's not well known among philosophers. The view that the linguist Ron Lanaker has of polysemy. He thinks that the meaning of a polysemous expression is what he calls a complex category, by which he means it's a network of senses. I should have that now. Network of senses united by modulation relation. So it's something very big. It's sort of a big network. With the senses that we talk about, they are there, but they are also related. The relation between the senses are also part of this network. Modulation relations, again, modulation is the sort of thing that happens in language use when you use an expression with a sense that's more specific than its lexical meaning, for example, or less specific when you do sense extension, when you speak metaphorically, possibly, and there are also metonymies, the sort of thing that people talk about in pragmatics, when indeed what you mean by saying, using the sentence, not exactly what the literal meaning of the sentence is, because there is this contextual adjustment of meaning to the particulars of the situation talked about. So I think modulation is the process, and that's also what these people, I mean, Rule also talks about modulation, and Lanaker as well. So modulation, I think, is a matter of language use. It's a pragmatic phenomenon, and it's the fundamental process through which a polysemous network. Is it okay? It's not too loud and there's no noise. The fundamental process through which a polysemous network starts to grow. So someone uses an expression, as I said, E with a certain sense. Let's suppose that there is a starting point, there is this sense S, that's the initial sense. And then someone else may use E with this sense F of S, where F is a modulation function. Like, you make S more specific. So, well, anyway, let's not give examples. I don't have time for that. So F of S is a new creative sense that arises in context. It's not semantic, it's just part of what you mean. But if this use is conventionalized, other people start using E with the sense F of S, then the meaning of E grows into a network which includes both S and F of S, and that's also important, that's an essential thing in Lanacker's framework, also the abstract schemata, which S and F of S both instantiate and which guide further applications of E. So the schematic, the abstract things that rule has are part of the network. What Lanacker says is that the network grows outward and upward at the same time. So each time you extend the meaning to new senses, you extract new commonalities and new schemata that fit all those uses. That is, there is this process of schema extraction that works, that's part and parcel of this process of growth of the network. So it's actually the theory of Lanacker includes rule theory as a sort of lower parts. Okay. So on this view, the meaning of the expression is the entire polysemous network, including both the abstract schemata and the conventionalized senses. Okay, and so whatever view we take, whether we do rules view that says that the meaning is a very abstract schema, we have no notion of it, it's something that has to be established empirically, and the only thing we have conscious of are specific senses, whether we say that or whether we say with Lanacker that the meaning, the lexical meaning, is the big network, which includes the senses and other things as well. In all cases, we find that the contributed sense, the predicate that in context is contributed to content by the expression used, the predicate expression used, that predicates the contributed sense is distant from the lexical meaning. It's not the same thing. And that's the hallmark of context sensitivity when you have this tension between the two levels. Of course, we don't know enough about this topic to be sure about exactly how speaker's meaning is involved. We don't really know how that works, how you go from the lexical meaning to the contributed content, but it's pretty likely that some dose of speaker's meaning is also part of what's needed to understand what's going on. Now, I have little time, but I said I would talk about assertion. I think that it's important for the reason I'm going to say, when it comes to assertion, the force of an utterance, it's pretty clear that that cannot be encoded. At least many people, Frege, Davidson, and many others have said that the asserted force of an utterance cannot be encoded it's something that goes beyond whatever can be encoded. And because of that, assertion must be fundamentally a matter of speaker's meaning. So I think that's right, but there is a problem with the ambiguity of force here that we have to disambiguate in order to make sense of that sort of claim, which was Frege and Davidson made. So practically, there's something about force that is encoded in language. So the type of speech act with a sentence is designed to perform. So for example, assertion versus order versus question. That is encoded. We have declarative sentence. We have sentence types like declarative, interrogative, imperative. That encodes the force of the utterance of the sentence, the force which an utterance of the sentence is supposed to have. So that's encoded. But when those people, Frege, Davidson, and others, say that force cannot be encoded, they mean something else. What cannot be encoded is whether or not the speaker is actually performing the encoded speech act. So that's force in that more pragmatic sense. That's the sense of force we have in both Frege and Austin, by the way. So that's the speaker is asserting, if she is something that can only be determined by considering the context and the speaker's likely intentions. So it's clear that force in that sense, the pragmatic sense, is something that cannot be encoded. It has to be a matter of speaker's meaning. Now, you might say, what does this have to do with the topic of this talk? Because we started talking about the content. I started saying that content is speaker meaning sensitive or context dependent and so on. In more dimensions than we thought, all the major functions and so on, I said. But now we're no longer talking about content, we're talking about force. And it's well known that force and content are two orthogonal dimensions, at least according to Frege. Austin has a sort of more complex positions. But anyway, this argument goes as this. It may well be that the part played by speakers, meaning that the speech at the level of force, is something that has to be acknowledged. It's maybe obvious. But that does not establish that a similar part is played by speakers, meaning at the level of content. Of course, there are all the arguments I gave for the speaker meaning sensitivity of content before, but talking about force and the context sensitivity of force is irrelevant. So that's the objection. And of course, it's pretty clear that according to Frege and orthodoxy, force does not affect content. There is Frege each argument and well-known reasons to keep them separate. But I think that in the context of the present discussion, that cannot be presupposed, because there are semantic frameworks, especially today. Many people are trying to reconsider the claim that there is this force-content distinction and that the orthogonal dimensions and force does not affect content. For example, Peter Hans has just published a book called Propositional Content, in which he says no content without force. You need the force in the content, as it were. If not, you don't have the problem with the unity of the proposition and so on. So that's a line, and other people are attracted to that. But also, and that's the view I'm going to defend, it's also possible to distinguish levels of content. When I talked about the determination thesis earlier, I said that there may be many steps from meaning, lexical meaning to or linguistic meaning to content. There may be all sorts of intermediary steps. And indeed, I think we need distinctions between levels of content. And if we have such distinctions, then I'm going to make one, then it will turn out that there is one level of content that's very important, because that's the level of truth conditions that we care about. That is affected by force. So force affects content. And if it does, and if force itself is matter of speakers, meaning that's an extra argument for the general claim I'm making. Now, the framework here, I know that there's 1 minute left, but taking advantage of the fact that the session is so long that, am I right, that it doesn't matter that much? So there is this situation theoretic framework, which actually starts from Austin's theory of truth, and then only going to, the only thing that matters is this theory, the theory of truth that is followed by Austin. So according to that view, which I find really very attractive, so I like it a lot, I use it a lot. It's attractive not only for thinking about language, but for thinking about thought as well. So the idea is that every utterance or every thought or any judgment is about a situation which it characterizes as being of a certain type. So whenever you think or you say something, it's always about something. There is no thought or speech that floats free of any topic that you're talking about. That's the view, and that seems to be right. So from this point of view, you can think of the content of an utterance in the narrow sense as being a property of situation, type of situation. And when you assert the content, when you present it as true, what you do actually is referring to the situation you have in mind, the topic situation, and presenting it as being of that type. And that's Austin's theory of truth. Austin said the utterance of thought, and every utterance of thought is about the situation, the topic situation, let's say. And the utterance of thought is true if and only if the topic situation is of the type that is expressed by the sentence. So the content of an utterance, which we think of in terms of a proposition, I mean, propositions are often modeled as set of words. That's fine. You might think of sets of situations instead, because that's broader, but words are just a special case, a maximal sort of situation. And then, when you assert the content is a type of situation, a type of world, a set of words, something like this, and you refer to a particular situation and you say that it is of that type. But the sentence itself, the utterance, the proposition that it expresses, is a type of situation. That's how we should be viewed. So when you assert the content, you apply the type or property of situation that's encoded by the sentence in context. You apply it to the particular situation that you have in mind. And that generates an extra level of content, which people in situation theory call the Austinian proposition. That's the proposition true if only if the topic situation is of the indicated type. And that's where the truth conditions are. We may also call that the full assertory content. I'm going to give an example because it's not obvious, but there you'll see immediately the two levels of content. So that's an example from Bauweiss and HMND. And Claire is the name of Bauweiss's daughter. So the example is this. So there is Bauweiss looking at people playing poker and commenting on the poker scene. So here it's the first person, but let's say it's me. So I'm looking at the scene, people are playing poker, and I comment on the scene by saying, oh, Claire has a good hand now. I can see. So suppose I say that. That expresses the proposition. Apparently, the proposition that Claire has a good hand now. That's a type of situation in which Claire has a good hand now. Or maybe the set of words in which Claire has a good hand now, something like this. Now, suppose that it turns out that I was mistaken. Claire is not even among the players. There are other people there. So she's not among the players. But it turns out that unbeknown to everybody, she happens to be playing maybe another type of game, like bridge, at the other end of town. And she happens to have a good hand there at the time at which I say what I say. So that's an interesting case. Because if we ask whether the utterance is true or false, there are two distinct sets of intuitions here. There is one set of intuition that if I said really that Claire has a good hand now, and if she turns out to have a good hand now, where she is, that means that's true. But intuitively, in the context, given that I was talking about that situation, we will not say that it is true. We say either that it was false or that was, I don't know exactly what we're going to say, but we're going to resist the claim that the utterance was true. Why? Because I was talking about this situation. So the import of my utterance is this Austinian proposition. I was referring to this situation and presenting this situation as a situation in which Claire has a good hand. Now, that situation is not a situation in which Claire has a good hand because Claire is not even playing in that situation. Of course, there is another situation in which she has a good hand, but I was not talking about that situation. So there are these two levels of content. There is the content, which is just the proposition that Claire has a good hand. That proposition, if we evaluate it with respect to the actual world, it is true. But when we say something, the proposition we express is supposed to be evaluated with respect to the situation we're talking about. And in this case, when we evaluate the claim made with respect to the situation we're talking about, we don't find that it is true. So I think that the proper theory of assertory content has to acknowledge the Austinian proposition as the relevant level for normatively assessing the assertion as correct or incorrect. Clearly, the assertion was incorrect in the case I've described. And we need a way of actually capturing that intuition. I say it's incorrect because the target situation, the poker game I'm watching is not of the relevant type. So let's accept this. What's nice with this sort of view is that it's regularized, it's every utterance, every thought is about the topic situation that it presents as being of a certain type. And the utterance is true at the relevant level, the Austinian proposition level, if only if the topic situation is of that type. And there are many cases in which the content of the utterance, the thing that we evaluate at a situation, will not even be a full classical proposition because of matters that I better not say anything about. Okay. So anyway, the situation an utterance is about is entirely a matter of speaker's meaning. So when you say something, what you're talking about is up to you. Again, and of course, you have to make it manifest to the other, it must be possible to understand you and so on, but it's up to you. And it's not something that's included, though there might be, candidates for including all that sort of thing. But anyway, one and the same sentence can be interpreted with respect to any situation. So when you say something, that can be interpreted with this or that situation, and different truth conditions will result. And because the truth condition of an utterance depends upon the topic situation, I say that the topic situation itself depends upon speaker's meaning. I think that it shows that the truth condition of an utterance depends upon the speaker's meaning. And it's a matter of assertion because the act of assertion, I think, includes as an ancillary act, the act of selection of the particular situation you're talking about. So that's part of the act of assertion. That's what I'm saying, that this is an aspect of the complex dependence of assertion. Okay, so I guess I'm going to stop there. There was one thing that I thought we might talk about that might be in the Q&A, which is given that there are these different aspects of the speech organic dependency involving several and different speech functions, it might be interesting to try to reduce some aspect to the other. For example, Houghton and Manley said they try to reduce the context dependence of reference to the context dependence of quantification, thinking that. And there are other ways of doing that sort of thing, so we will talk about that, but I'll stop here since I'm already beyond my time. Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. We're going to have a 10 minutes pause for coffee and snacks, and then we'll come back here for the question sessions. Please.
Aquí, o sea, ¿por qué? ¿Cuál es el significado del
Yes, yes, I have a lot of questions. I'll try to restrict myself to a couple.
Yo con el tengo y después vamos a echar muchas chocolatitas. Sí, yo creo que sí, ya vieron.